Hi Lisa. How are you? I was thinking about discussing an interesting topic for our English podcast. How about talking about the differences between formal and informal English? Many students struggle to know when to use each.
Great idea, Phil. It's a super important topic that causes a lot of confusion. People often don't realize how different English can be depending on the context. Let's explore this in detail. Where do you think we should start?
How about starting with a basic definition? Formal English is generally used in professional, academic situations or with people we don't know well. Informal English is used with friends, family, and in more relaxed situations. The problem is that the line between them isn't always clear.
Exactly. And that fine line is what confuses many learners. For example, in a work email, you'd use "Dear Mr. Smith" and not "Hey dude." But what if it's a coworker you have a closer relationship with? That's where it gets more complicated, right?
Yes, these intermediate cases are the most challenging. A common mistake is using slang or contractions in formal situations. For example, someone might say "I wanna" instead of "I want to" in a job interview, which wouldn't be appropriate.
Good observation. Another common mistake is the excessive use of formal language in casual situations. Imagine someone saying, "I would be most grateful if you could pass the salt" at a dinner with friends. It sounds strange and even a bit comical, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Speaking of examples, how about we explore some common phrases and their formal and informal versions? For instance, "What's up" is very informal. In a more formal context, we could say "How are you?" or "How do you do?" if it's very formal.
Great example. Another would be the difference between "gonna" and "going to." "I'm gonna go to the store" is super informal, while "I am going to the store" is more neutral. In a very formal context, we might even say, "I intend to visit the store."
Excellent. We also have expressions like "give me a hand," informal, versus "could you please assist me?" Formal. It's interesting to note how formal language tends to be longer and more indirect, while informal is more direct and short.
That's right. And we can't forget about greetings and farewells. "Hi" and "bye" are informal, while "good morning" and "goodbye" are more formal. In a very formal email, we might even use "Dear Sir/Madam" and "Yours sincerely."
Speaking of emails, that's a minefield of potential formality errors. Many students don't know how to adjust the tone depending on the recipient. For example, starting an email to your boss with "Hey boss" would be inappropriate in most cases.
I totally agree. In professional emails, it's better to err on the side of formality. Use "Dear Mr./Ms." last name if you're not familiar. "Hello" name can work for colleagues you know well. And always end with something like "best regards" or "sincerely" instead of "see ya."
Another important aspect is the use of "please" and "thank you." In formal contexts, they're almost mandatory. "Could you please send me the report?" sounds much more polite than "send me the report."
Exactly. And in informal situations, we can be more direct. With friends, pass the salt is perfectly acceptable. But with strangers or informal settings, could you please pass the salt, is more appropriate.
Speaking of being direct, the use of imperatives also varies greatly between formal and informal. Sit down is quite informal, while please have a seat or would you like to sit down are more formal and polite.
Great observation. That reminds me of another important difference, the use of can versus may to ask for permission. Can I use your phone is more informal, while may I use your phone sounds more formal and polite.
Excellent example. We also have the issue of pronouns. In formal English, whom is still used instead of who in certain cases, like to whom it may concern. In everyday life, most people use who for everything.
True. And we can't forget about one as a formal impersonal pronoun. One should always be polite sounds much more formal than you should always be polite or people should always be polite.
Another thing students often confuse is the use of slang and idiomatic expressions in formal contexts. For example, saying that's cool in a business meeting might not be appropriate.
Yes, slang is dangerous territory. In formal situations, it's best to avoid it completely. Instead of, that's cool, we could say, that's interesting or that's a good idea. It's always safer to use neutral language in professional contexts.
I completely agree. And what do you think about using more sophisticated words in formal contexts? For example, using commence instead of start, or utilize instead of use.
Good question. This can be tricky. Although more sophisticated words might sound more formal, it's important not to overdo it. Using too many fancy words can make the speech sound pretentious or even incomprehensible.
Excellent point. It's a delicate balance. Speaking of balance, how do you think we should approach situations where the level of formality isn't clear? For example, in a first meeting with a potential client.
In these cases, I always recommend starting a bit more formal and then adjusting as the situation unfolds. It's easier to relax the tone than to try to make it more formal later. Observe how the other person communicates and try to mirror their level of formality.
Great advice. That reminds me of another thing, the importance of cultural context. In some cultures, like British culture, they tend to be more formal in professional situations than Americans, for example.
Excellent observation. Culture really does influence a lot. For example, in the US, it's common to call professors by their first name in universities, something that would be considered very informal in many other countries.
Speaking of cultural differences, the use of titles also varies. In very formal contexts in the UK, you might hear sir or madam, while in the US this is less common, except in customer service situations.
True. And in formal British emails, you might see yours faithfully when you don't know the recipient's name, while yours sincerely is used when you do. In the US, sincerely or best regards are more common in both cases.
Another thing students frequently ask about is the use of contractions. In very formal English, especially in writing, the use of contractions like don't, can't, etc. is avoided. It's better to use the full form, do not, cannot.
Exactly. And this extends to other forms of abbreviation too. In a formal text, you would write out, etc., instead of, etc., and use, for example, instead of e.g. These are small details, but they make a difference in the overall tone.
Speaking of tone, the use of humor also varies greatly between formal and informal, doesn't it? In a formal business presentation, jokes can be risky, while in a casual conversation with colleagues, humor is welcome.
Certainly. Humor can be a powerful tool for building relationships, but in formal contexts, you need to be very careful. A poorly placed joke in a formal situation can be disastrous.
I totally agree. Another interesting aspect is how formality can change depending on the medium of communication. An email tends to be more formal than a text message, for example.
Great observation. And with the rise of social media and messaging apps, the lines between formal and informal are becoming increasingly blurred. It's a challenge to know how to communicate appropriately on each platform.
Speaking of challenges, many students struggle with sentence structure in formal English. For example, the use of passive voice is more common in formal texts. The decision was made instead of we made the decision.
Excellent example. And we can't forget about conditional phrases. In formal English, especially in academic or legal contexts, the use of the conditional should is common. Should you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact us.
That makes me think about how formal English often sounds a bit old-fashioned to native speakers. Phrases like "I should be most grateful" might seem excessively formal in everyday life.
Exactly. That's why it's important to teach students not just the rules, but also the context and real usage. The English they hear in movies or music can be very different from what they find in a textbook.
I completely agree. I think we've covered many important aspects of formal versus informal English. How about we summarize some key points for our listeners?
Great idea. First, always consider the context, who your interlocutor is, what the situation is, and what the medium of communication is. Second, when in doubt, start more formal and adjust as needed.
Excellent. Third, pay attention to vocabulary, sentence structure, and use of contractions. Fourth, remember that being formal doesn't mean being complicated. Clarity is always important.
Perfect. And last but not least, practice. The more exposed you are to different contexts in English, the more natural it will be to adjust your level of formality.
Great summary, Lisa. I think our listeners will have a lot to think about and practice after this episode. Thank you for this productive discussion.
Thank you, Phil. It was a pleasure discussing this important topic. I hope our listeners found it useful and that it helps them navigate better between formal and informal English.